Lately, I've been fascinated by Intel's Express line of networking equipment, which came out in the late 90s. In a previous video, I did some light cleaning on a 510T switch and a 220T hub to get them up and running. Since then, the collection has grown, with the ultimate goal being to stack these units in order to see what the stack management experience is like in the Intel Device View UI. But these stack cables and modules are proving hard to find or prohibitively expensive. So in the meantime, Doug Boom, a principal engineer with nearly 30 years of experience working on Ethernet at Intel, was kind enough to sit down and tell some stories about what it was like back when the Express line was being developed. Doug actually sat next to the folks who created the Intel Device UI, and we'll hear about some official performance testing they did on the Express switches playing Quake after hours.
I was usually the third best player on our team, and we had some world class talent in those days.
Let's get into it. Hi, Doug. Thanks for joining me today. Go ahead and introduce yourself to us and let us know how you ended up at Intel.
Thanks. It's great to be with you today. My name's Doug Boom, and I've been associated around Intel Ethernet for 29 years. And I started at Intel Ethernet as a lab technician. I called myself the lab monkey because it was under tables, pulling cables. We actually had a raised floor, so I had to actually pull up tiles and go under the floor, and that was always very interesting. To be very clear, I do not speak for Intel. The opinions expressed here are my own. Even though I've got the shirt on and everything else like that, I'm Doug Boom, private citizen today, and was really excited to see the old hardware up and running in your video, and was excited to get a chance to talk to you a little bit more about the behind the scenes.
Yeah, great. I'm super excited. So that Intel gear actually sort of hit a nerve or excited people. I was looking at my analytics before this interview, and it's the best performing video of the last 10 I've posted. So, and I got all sorts of comments about, I didn't know Intel made all that stuff. So we're going to be talking a lot about the Intel Express line of switches and hubs. And for context, I just turned 36 this year. So I remember in the year 2000-ish, when I was sort of getting into networking with LAN parties and stuff, getting a little serious, my buddies and I would have hubs that we would hook our computers up with. Very quickly after that, it was eclipsed by switches. And
Yep.
so maybe the younger crowd or the non-networking crowd, and I've got the expert on the line. What's the difference between a hub and a switch?
Right. So fundamentally, Ethernet started in the late 70s as a communication protocol for connecting Hawaiian Islands. And they actually used a over-the-air radio system. And because of that, they needed a collision detection system. So you'd basically yell and say, "Hey, is anybody broadcasting?" And then you'd listen. If nobody said anything, then you were clear to keep going. And so what happened was that led to a topology we call half duplex. And then when you can have the conversation where both are talking at the same time, that's a full duplex. And hubs are a half duplex construct where every port gets everything simultaneously. And so if one port is sending, all of the rest of them have to be silent because all the rest of them are receiving. On a switch, because it is full duplex, every individual port can have private conversations with every other individual port, because it's effectively what happens inside of the silicon is that it makes a private conversation. And so it's a very broadcast oriented in the hubs, and it's very private conversations in the switches. And within 3 years, you went from everybody had hubs because they were cheap to everybody had switches because they were cheap and they were just much, much, much better. Half duplex is actually a silly rarity, and in the faster speeds, 1 gig and 10 gig, and 25, 50, and 100, there is only full duplex. Half duplex is a little bit of a dinosaur.
Right. And that really fast advancement from hubs to switches was it, well, obviously it's a better idea. The switch, it's a better approach. But is it really just the cost came down and hubs were around because it was cheaper?
There were some technology challenges that made half duplex more interesting, um, because in the old days, literally, what was called 10 B 10 base 5. It was actually a cable that was probably about as, it was that thick, and you actually had to vampire tap into it where you'd actually drill into the medium. And so you had this literal, that's where the phrase network backbone came in, because it was a cable that was the size of a backbone.
Right.
And that media was shared, so there wasn't this ability to have two conversation at once, because the cable itself, the medium itself, could only support one conversation at a time. And so that's why half duplex really got started. But as we moved to the not only fiber, but then copper with its multiple twisted pairs, and it gave you enough medium, physical medium, to work with to have these simultaneous conversations.
Start getting away with something like that,
Yeah,
basically.
and the performance difference is just outrageous, because on a hub, the throughput of the product is the throughput of any one port, where the throughput of each individual port can go on a switch, is that's just its one slice. So if you have a 10 port, 10 megabit switch, you will get 100 megabits internally, and that's why you see these modern switches are terabytes, right? Because it's just the internal architecture has to be able to support all these simultaneous conversations.
Awesome. So let's talk about, if you don't mind, the Express line, which came out, I think, in the late 90s with Intel. And like I was saying, myself included, until one of these came my way, I had no idea they even existed. So, what do you remember about that time and where the whole Express line came from?
Yeah, so back in those days, the brand was called Intel Ether Express, and kind of our business unit was chartered with taking Ethernet, which Intel had helped found with DEC and Xerox in the early 80s, kind of take it to another level. And so we started making more and more advanced adapter cards, but then it really came down to uh, cards need to have somebody to talk through, and the switch market and the hub market, we felt was not as creative as perhaps we were being with adapters. And so in those days, we were kind of chartered with, if it smells like business, you could go after it. And we had enough things in our portfolio where we felt like we could handle it. And so, in order to inspire more cost-effective items within the market of switches and hubs, we elected to get into the Ether Express switch business, and started with hubs like everybody does, because you had to have a tiered product, right? Where the hubs were the entry level and the switches were the really business level.
Mhm.
And the two of them were stablemates, and I sat between, let's see, Norm sat that way and Todd sat that way, of the guys who wrote the GUI that you were playing with during
That,
your last video.
that was going to be my next question. So the Intel device view, once I could get my hands on it, it was a little tricky to find it. It was really interesting setting that all up. So I factory reset the 510T switch just to see
Mhm.
what that would be like, and I needed to get a new password on it. And I put it on a network that the UI was physically connected to with the computer, and it auto detected it. It was a really modern, what I would call a modern experience. Oh, look at that. It found it. This is really interesting. Wow. That was pretty slick. As opposed to contemporary Cisco switches at the time. So
Yeah.
was that, it felt like it was being marketed towards someone that maybe IT wasn't their full-time job. They were like the computer person at work. The network was growing. Because I mean, for lack of a better word, it was just easy to set these things up and use them. The documentation was very good. Is that an accurate take on it?
Yeah, it's a very accurate take, and because we actually had dedicated user experience people at the time, that was going to be one of the competitive advantages of the product line, was it was going to be very sensitive to cost. It was going to be an entry level switch, and hub, and then it was going to be almost trivial to manage, because of the work that people like Todd and Norm put into it. And we used to act back in those days. We did what we called eat our own dog food, and so we actually had to, well, say, enhance, give somebody a box of cookies to leave the server door open a little bit, so we could put those in. Corporate was only 10 megabit, and those switches are 10100. and we wanted to eat our own dog food, and so we got access to the floor's data rack, and we replaced all of our 10 meg switches, 10 meg hubs with those 100 meg switches. And so I think that's what inspired some of the user experience, was if it was because we were using our own materials, if it was hard, then for us we wouldn't want it, and so then we became kind of our own first consumers.
That's awesome. I think it showed, at least. So I'm not a professional network person. I do this, as you can tell in the videos. I do this as a hobby, but I'm starting to get a few experiences under my belt setting all this stuff up. And yeah, it just felt like, I think I said it in the video. It felt like some energy and thought went into these things, which was really fun to play with.
Yeah, and you know, we felt like we wanted it to have something where it wasn't, you had to go take a class to be able to do the infrastructure for your office, for your small office, for example, where like you had to go take an hour and learn how to do, shut, no shut commands
Yep.
for the GUIs, and there's labels to get to things, to get to things, to get to things, to get to things, just to set the link, right? And so we wanted it to be kind of trivial. And I just remember one time, part of this testing we would do would often extend after hours, and we were a whole bunch of just young nerds at the time, and so we were playing Quake, which was all the rage at the day. And I was usually the third best player on our team, and we had some world class talent at in those days. Norm was amazing. If there was a pro league in '99 for Quake, Norm, or '96 for Quake, Norm would have gone pro. He was just an amazing player, and I was just, for whatever reason, he was out of his groove, and I was just dominating, and I was sassing him over the wall because remember, he sits right behind me, and he's like, "I'd be a darn shame if something happened to your switch port, Doug." And I was like, "Oh, you wouldn't dare." And he's like, "Oh yeah." And I immediately leapt over the cue ball, and I was looking, and I could see the GUI was up, and he just saw the deactivate,
Oh,
and I
in
was
the
kicked
Intel
out of the
design
game.
view, remote
Yep,
management,
yep. And I learned, there's people to SaaS and there's people not to SaaS in your IT. The person who controls whether your port is active or
whether
not,
you're
that's
on the
that's
online.
not somebody you want to SaaS. So,
But, I mean, that's like another perfect example of maybe not dog fooding the way a business would, but I mean, we all have stories about being in the office and playing games after hours on the corporate infrastructure, right? Yeah,
yep,
such a common thing.
we would call it performance testing because there's nothing like real world scenarios, like, a bunch of engineers playing. I mean, it was a huge multiplayer game. You could have 8 people, right? And so it was pretty funny. It even got to the point where one of our other business segments, the server guys, they were actually running world accessible servers as a way to test the performance of their own systems.
Yeah.
And when we found out that it was in the DMZ, which meant we could get to it from our own corporate network, but it was still worldwide accessible, we started having Quake matches against the best in the world. And because we were a 10 megabit, it was 10 megabit between our building and their building. We had 10 megabit link where it was like ADSL or even ISDN back in those days. We were getting, tiny pings, and they were getting triple digit pings. And it was funny because people would come to that server and be like, take on the world's best, and they were all Intel employees. It was pretty
Intel
fun.
employees testing the express line of Switch.
Yep.
I love it. So you were sitting around the guys that did the UI. What
Mhm.
did you have any hands-on involvement in the express line?
I worked quite a bit with the PHY that's inside of it. I actually have one for
Yeah.
this is the 82.555 PHY,
Yep.
and those were the ones that you were trying to dust off. That's
They're in
that's
both the hub
actually,
and the Switch.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's a 100 megabit PHY that Intel made at those times. The other big vendor is that's this chip here, is this is the national PHY. So it's the another vendor's version of the same technology. At the time, Intel and a company called 3Com
Yep.
was consuming like 98% of the worldwide availability of those 100 megabit PHYs. And so, with that level of constraint, it was obvious that that was something that we should produce our own version of. And so our silicon team in Israel created the 82.555, and that's why we had so many of these new products come out. We were able to integrate it where we went from this product with all these extra silicons on it to the next generation where there's just the one chip. This is the 82558. It's literally this chip here with the 82555 glued onto it.
All into it.
Um, and that 555 gave us that it was such a good product that would enabled us to try these things out, like making the switch line, and made a whole series of adapters and really revolutionized the way that Ethernet was produced and consumed.
Awesome. Just to ask a basic question, what does the PHY do at a high level, the chip itself?
Yeah. So for Ethernet, there's a physical layer, which is where you take the that's the part you actually plug the cable into, and then there's a media access controller that actually functions kind of like a cheese grater, where you'll get like a big blob that'll be like your Word document, and you can't cram that whole meg or whatever size file through a network. You've got to slice it up into discrete chunks, and that's what the Mac does. And then the PHY actually takes that digital stream and makes it into an analog stream typically. And the PHY is just voodoo, to be clear. When you get to the faster speeds, it gets more and more miraculous to the point where we professionally describe 10 gigabit copper as picking out the right snowflake in a snowstorm at night while you're in a building with the drapes closed.
Yeah, because the faster it gets, the faster that conversion has to take place, right?
And the more noise becomes impactful to the point of we actually have it looks like it's just a big gray pattern, and it's like, well, the first level DSP removes this noise, and the second level DSP removes this noise, and then this noise, and then this noise, and you end up with this 1 and 0 stream that comes out the other side. And that's where when 10 gigabit copper was first coming out, it's kind of like miracle occurs portion of the schematic. And that all started with the 555, where going 10 times as fast was I mean, we literally called it fast Ethernet,
Right.
not necessarily expecting there to be
Fast.
within my own career 100 gigabit and faster.
Yeah. I kind of postulated in the video just offhand that I was looking inside the switch and the hub, and there's tons of Intel chips in there, of course, these included. And was that a factor maybe in being able to drive the cost down because you were your own one of the largest fabs in the world?
That was the start of things, but where things got, and one of the reasons why that product line didn't continue
Mm.
significantly beyond the first two phases, was the 82555 was a single port solution. And so as you saw inside of the chassis, to get to 16 ports, you have to have 16 of the chips. Well, the other vendors in the market and the switch vendors, especially people like Cisco, they recognized that if they could increase the single silicon density, where they had like an octal Mac or an octal PHY where they had 8 ports,
Mhm.
it cuts down the real estate, it cuts down on the power, it cuts down on the cost. Even though it's a bigger product, it's still going to be one that's twice as much real estate to make is still going to be cheaper than 8 individual chips. Uh, we started on our own 8-port Mac and 8-port PHY. The 8-port PHY came first, and this is when I learned to really appreciate my Israeli engineering cohort, their sense of humor. The code name was Megiddo, and all of us Americans are like, "Yay, Megiddo, Megiddo, Megiddo!" And then they're like, "Yeah, Megiddo's not gonna, the financials of Megiddo don't work. We're gonna kill it." Well, later I was actually in Jerusalem talking to some engineers about things, and I was like, "What's why? Where do you get them up with with your code names like Megiddo?" And he's like, "Well, Americans don't, we call it Megiddo, but most Americans call it by the hill that's nearby, which is Armageddon." So the actual code name that they gave the PHY was basically the Israeli version of Armageddon, because they knew this thing was going to be a tragedy of a train
Wasn't
wreck of a plane
wasn't going to
crashing into a
work.
mountain. Yeah. And so that's when I was like, wow, you guys take a whole nother level to your code name game. and that's now why we don't use the geographic the regional specific code names like that anymore. We use U.S. geography names only,
Okay.
because we found out that there's lots of little puns in the names that they used out of our Israeli team
But you might
that
not
are
understand.
you wouldn't know unless you asked, and no, none of our management ever did, but I was dumb enough to do it. So there's some fun ones there.
That's awesome. So the 8 port PHY didn't work out for technical reasons, I guess, or cost, I
It
guess.
was it was a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. We were making so many adapters and was so commercially successful with adapters. The real kind of drive of bringing the overall switch cost down, we felt that that was successful, and so it was like, let's just stick with our A game. Let's, keep our eye on that prize, because we had more fish to fry as we recognized that 1 gigabit was coming, 10 gigabit was coming, and with the resources that we had, we just kind of had to elect that the switch market was a periphery that we while we enjoyed, it was not necessarily a core competency, and so we just kind of exited it. And that's the switch went away, Megiddo went away, and everything else, and we did turn into a very successful 1 gig and 10 gig business. So it was, in
Definitely.
hindsight, it was probably the right call, and then it's unfortunate for the customers at the time. And I loved that 550. That one, it was always fun to play with the button, because you could make the LEDs change of with the buttons. So it
Yeah,
was always fun to play with.
I'll have to get a clip of that in. Yeah, yeah. Cool machines, especially with the modularity and stuff for such, I won't call it a budget switch, but because it's a pretty serious piece of equipment, but just the fact that it even had the modularity built into the architecture is really impressive for the price point, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that some of that is, historically there was an adjacent business unit. So at those times we were all part of what was called PCEO, so PC Enhancement Organization, and it was ways to encourage more CPU workloads, as well as making sure that you protected adjacencies is the modern word for it. So there was another product called the Intel Storage Express, or a STEX. If you can get one of those, that's a serious miracle play, because those things are stupid rare, and they
Never.
really only work with NetWare,
Ooh,
which is an extinct OS now, right?
yeah.
That was one of the first technologies that I worked with, so I deeply love and miss NetWare to this day.
I've got a box
Um,
right up there of it. Eventually I'll get to it.
is it 2, 3, or
Let me
5?
grab it for you. It might be an upgrade. It is. Oh, it's NetWare Lite V11.
Okay,
So,
that's the DR DOS stuff. Yeah, okay.
yeah, so it's not
Uh,
pure NetWare.
yeah. You haven't had fun until you've installed an OS off of 45 floppies.
Yeah, that's right.
And I did it wrong, so I had to do it
You got to
again.
start over.
And I had to start over, so I had to
Yeah.
feed it
Or
45 floppies.
you find out floppy 39's broke, doesn't work or something.
The Stex guys, they had a lot of the modularity. They had the same kind of chassis look to it, so that kind of
Okay.
dark gray feel to it. That was some
Yeah.
stuff that we kind of vibed off of them. That was the kind of Intel corporate was really big off of, it looks like Intel, and
Yeah.
that's the drop E, that type of stuff back in those days. And so having it look like the other kind of stable mates was really important. And the woman who actually program managed the actual physical chassis, she was actually my manager for a couple years, Holly, and she's just a genuinely awesome human being. When I told her I was going to be on this, she was all excited, because those were fun days for her as well, because that product was one of those build it if you can, and we built
Yeah.
it better than we thought. And
And it was out
it
there. I mean,
was,
you were selling them. Yeah, it's a
yeah.
real product.
And the one of the reasons that your video is doing so well is I forwarded it to a whole bunch of people, because I was like, do you guys remember this?
Excellent.
So,
Well, you can tell
so
Holly,
fun to see them still living.
Holly produced an excellent chassis because it's hard to convey over, video. It's hefty, it's solid, it's all
Yeah.
metal. There's very little plastic. It's almost like this matte, very matte gray paint. Feels good to the it's just a professional,
Mhm.
solid product. Like,
Yep.
yeah, even compared to some, more expensive Cisco switches, like their face plates are falling off and stuff. And these
Yeah.
things are tank. You could throw it across the room and it'd be fine.
as they were heading towards not really being functional anymore, we would actually use them as stepping stools
Yeah,
because
I
they would take the
believe
weight
you.
of an adult pretty easily.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Um, those were actually manufactured in our Puerto Rico facilities.
Oh, okay.
And the tradition of the great engineers that came from our Puerto Rico facilities lives on to this day, where they, when we elected to, for business reasons, close that facility, they came here and live with us in Oregon. And Dave and Tommy and a bunch of other people are just we had worldwide talent even in those days.
Yeah, that's
Although
great.
Puerto Rico is the United States, so it's no passports required, which is off throws up people a lot of the time.
Yeah, I've been there once and it's funny. Feels like you're going to a different country, but you walk right in and yeah. You mentioned that the 82555 sort of let Intel, I guess experiment might not be the right word, but produce a bunch of networking equipment because it was such a successful chip. And so I was wondering, I just picked this up if you recognize this like slightly adjacent line
Yep.
in business. So this seems like it was like a smaller business type play versus
Yes.
the kind of big switches.
That was an acquisition that we made. I believe it was called Dace. They were a Denmark operation, and we wanted to supplement where the big iron switches were more kind of corporate. We wanted to have something that was small business or home office kind of a thing. And so we picked up we had an acquisition where we acquired them, and so that's why there's a little bit of a different feel to it.
Hmm.
Our branding also evolved a little bit. You notice the box has got the bright colors.
Yeah,
Landman isn't as featured, if at all.
we do need to talk
um,
about Landman soon.
and that was the start of our marketing trending in a different direction, and those were even rarer than the 550s, the T550s. And so um, those ones were a little bit weird because we literally Norm and Todd were like, what the hell's this? Because it
Uh,
just kind of just showed up as a, hey, this is supplementing our product line. And so it felt kind of like an OEM in type of situation. And then that, we exited that business simultaneously with the rest of it, and so it all kind of collapsed very quickly.
right. Interesting. It's funny when I think of Intel, I of course think of CPUs and for some reason still the Pentium. Um, but obviously Intel's been in the networking game for so long and dabbled. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Just made my night.
I've got bodies, right? So
Yeah. Oh yeah, there it is, the big one. That's awesome. But yeah, you were mentioning that Intel's been part of Ethernet at least for a long time and helped develop it. And then you think a little bit deep, you think a little bit more about it, and you're like, well, maybe probably most of the network interface cards I've ever used in any of my PCs, Intel was involved. And so what kind of, in your opinion, what kind of keeps Intel pretty heavy in that aspect of networking, the cards and the NICs and everything?
when the first rumblings of Ethernet were forming in those Hawaiian Islands, um, you know, uh, Bob Metcalf, who later went off to 3Com, was really like the grandfather of Ethernet. Intel picked up very quickly that CPUs needed more of the world in order to have more to do. Right? Is that human inputs and floppy drives and the old serial MFM hard drives, right? Is that none of them, even the isobus, none of them could drive the amount of IO that was heading our way on the roadmap. And so when you move from 286 to 386 to 486 to Pentium, you've got to feed that stuff to do. And that PCEO organization, that was their charter of make more happen to get, make more go to the CPUs. And so that's where Intel really got involved with Ethernet. They joined with DEC and Xerox. Metcalf was part of Xerox PARC, their research agency back in that time. And just a CPU by itself is an interesting paperweight, but a CPU on like today, the internet, that's something that can influence things and change the world.
Yeah, well, yeah, it makes complete sense when you say it like that. I can't sit here and saturate my CPU, but the internet can. And that has to
Yeah,
travel over a network of some type, right?
yeah. I modern viewers are probably, I mean, I remember getting on an acoustic coupler and actually doing a 300 baud modem to play a game on a BBS.
Hmm.
And it would make, like Dwarf Fortress look like, a modern AAA game, right? Where those non-GUI implement, I played the original Rogue on the
Yeah, yeah,
Unix
yeah.
box, right? Where it's all characters and what the hell's an A versus a dot and a slash and, all that rest of the type of stuff.
Right.
Um, and just watching the technologies evolve from it's fun to play Quake to, Intel Ethernet has been involved with the streaming of every Olympics since 1996. You don't go to jail or college in the state of California without Intel Ethernet. You can probably see I have a Lego set of a Martian rover. Intel Ethernet works on the Sky Crane.
On Mars.
So I like to joke that we're the number one Ethernet provider on this planet and another and the others, right? So
Technically.
it's very humbling to know your work is, taking mankind to that next level, and started with the humble beginnings of, some of our old giant cards that that's what happens. You gotta walk before you can, you know, before you can run.
Yeah.
So this is a 1 gigabit card, and this is a 10 megabit card. So you can see how much things have changed
Yeah.
over the.
Cheaper, smaller, and faster,
Yeah,
which you usually
we,
can't have all that, right? So,
yeah, and we
yeah.
used to joke that, if cars performed like Ethernet, you'd get, 4,000 miles to the gallon, and you would, be flying and all the rest of that type of stuff, because it's literally the first card that I worked with, as a tester, is this giant thing. And this was our 100 megabit card, and now I have a 100 gigabit card. So that's a
Wow.
thousand times faster.
Incredible. And the 100 megabit back then probably
Was
felt like
brand
it's
new.
never
Yeah,
going
it
to get
was.
faster than this, right?
I mean, we were seeing deployments, to Wall Street and, to cluster servers and everything, because 100 megabits was just like, you can't believe how fast that is.
I
And
remember kind of getting my hands on it for the first time, and you're like, this is it. This is the future. Like, I'll never fill this link up.
and the fun part is I actually ran a benchmark. Being a wired Ethernet engineer, my house is wired for gigabit, and this is I did a speed test, and I was actually able to get 1 gig to through my house out to my house, and that was just like, that's a residential speed now. I mean, that was a only the top tier, right? Your DNS servers, your DHCP servers, the absolutely pinnacle servers within your network complex, those you would be for 1 gig. And now that's just kind of what we have at the house. It's been stupendous.
I guess that's a pretty nice segue. I kind of wanted to ask you, it must have been just incredible, and well, it still is, I'm sure, to have been there from the 10-bit all the way to now. I mean, has it felt like a whirlwind that it's just like it's just flown by, I'm guessing, and you know what I mean?
That's what was so delightful about your video, was it made me appreciate, and everybody I've shared it with, it made us all appreciate how much the journey has been, and how different things are. So like this is our first generation 10 gigabit card, and this thing here is called a Zen pack, and it's been replaced with this tiny little SFP plus module. And that's how fast the technology has evolved. That's how much, the cost of this card this card was hilarious, because we were selling these for like $1,500 or something. A single port on a Cisco switch, they sold a single port blade, $1 million for a single port.
I believe it. Believe it.
And now, this module is, not anywhere near that, and the card that it plugs into is not anywhere near that. And this is a dual port, so you're even actually getting double the capabilities versus that old behemoth. And
Cost
it's
going down. I mean, I can pick up those SFP plus adapters.
yeah,
What you're
they're
getting,
dirt
it
cheap.
feels like nothing on Amazon. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah, and just the form factor alone, right, is like the reason that Zen pack was offset from the front of the card, was that you had to have it was broadcasting at such power that you had to have an attenuation distance before you exited the card. Otherwise, you would actually potentially burn out other optical modules. We used to put stickers on those that would be, do not look at laser with remaining eye, right? Is that
As a
you
score.
had to make sure the little covers were on it before you turned it on or off, because it was, we joked that it was more lightsaber than light networking.
Right. What year was that card from? The first 10 gig?
That's from 1997.
Oh wow.
So
Oh, so
we
that was a
that was
really early.
simultaneously. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the hidden secret, is that the difference between 10 100 was 10 meg to 100 meg was about 6 years, and then it was about 3 years, and then it was about 2 years, and we actually very quickly got into the speeds went off very quickly. We actually had three simultaneous teams. We had a 10 100 team, we had a 1 gig team, and a 10 gig team, that were all simultaneously developing. That card had problems because the bus couldn't do 10 gigs. The interface could do 10 gigs, but the bus feeding it the data couldn't do it,
Yeah, yeah.
until PCI Express came into play and really took it off to that next level. So that's what kind of caused the plateau. Was you couldn't, while the modules and the media could do those faster speeds, the entities feeding it couldn't. And so until PCI Express took over, that's why that's kind of slowed down, and that's why you're seeing speeds go so fast these days, because it's PCI Gen 2, 3, 4, 5,
Really
6,
taking,
and
it's
it
incredible
seems
how
like it's
fast all that stuff
every,
is.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's it's like Moore's law has hit the bus,
Yeah.
and it's getting a little crazy down there.
Yeah, interesting. We have to talk about Landman. So I made some jokes about Landman in my video.
Yep,
Just because that was like the art style of the time, you know.
it
But I
was.
didn't know he had a name until you left the comment.
Yes, and he was all over our manuals. It was over our marketing material, and it was we as engineers would look at it and go,
What
"Is
it-
it a guy?
yeah,
What is it?" And it's supposed to be representative of like the god Mercury, right? So he's got wing motifs expressing that there's motion, that there's movement. We called him Landman just because that's what we were. But it was, we actually had kind of a little farewell for him when they moved to that more brighter coloring that you had on that in
that's
business box.
here, yeah.
Yeah, so all of our boxes got that little bright stuff, and Landman was gone, and so back in those days, we had very raucous offsites. We had a large number of people who were performers, and so we would rent a space, and they would, enough of our engineers would play guitar and have a jam, and we kind of had an Irish wake for Landman, and had a good time with it. There was actually a networking technology that was built into OS 2 that
Mhm.
was called Landman.
Oh,
And so that land manager is what it was shortened for. But he was our landman, and we loved him. And that's when we went from the Ether Express name to the Pro name. That this is a shirt actually from
yeah.
probably 2000. It still fits though. It
Yeah, I was
still
gonna say, good
fits.
job.
Still fits. Still
Yeah, that's
fits.
excellent.
Um, and that's kind of the marketing that we still have now. It's still the Intel Pro line of adapters.
I guess I should get some Landman t-shirts or something made up. Intel would care.
they're
I don't think Intel
they're
would care.
hard to find. I used to have one,
Oh yeah.
and back in those days, we basically got shirts for every product launch,
Mhm.
and my wife turned them into cleaning rags because I had so many of them.
Well, yeah, you don't
Um,
think about it at the time. They just
yeah,
keep coming, right? Yeah.
yep. We did a shirt. So when we were playing Descent 3 at the time, in the offices, and one of the marketing people came by, and they're like, "What you doing?" And we're like, testing." And they're like, "I want this. I want to use this. We're going to use this." And so they made, we've Descent 3 at 100 megabit rocks, and on the back it said for purely testing purposes.
Perfect.
And that one became my wife's painting shirt. So when like we're doing painting the bathroom or something, I'll
Mm-hmm.
see that shirt again because that's her painting shirt. But our marketing guy Willem actually got into a little bit of trouble because he actually hadn't talked to the Descent 3 people to get the logo right. But that was smoothed over pretty quick because they got it, it was a love note, and it was good times at the then.
That's awesome. To close us out, I think we already know the answer based on the conversation, but you know what keeps you at Intel and passionate about Ethernet? I mean, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but
I don't. I really. So I'm not a spring chicken anymore, and in the middle part of my career, I was just working with so many really cool design wins that I would forget to come home. I worked with the Shuttle Safe program with NASA. They, because they had in those days they had an HD feed that had to be to Houston within 5 minutes of launch, so they could abort the launch if they had to, looking for debris. Working with people like Collins Aviation, um, Boeing for getting products into airplanes. I don't think people really appreciate how we don't really live, in my perspective, we don't live in the internet age, we live in the Ethernet age. And as a transport medium, it has really allowed things like the internet to take off, like home automation, being able to have like this conversation we're having when I started was impossible, right? We would never have this type of a dialogue.
yeah,
Um, and it's just been really humbling to see what when you give partners ingredients, what they can turn it into. um, and you go with them on that journey of like, hey, I can only I want this module to only transmit because it's a security module, and if it could receive something, then somebody could hack the space plane and make it crash. And I didn't say the word space plane, right? um, that's the type of stuff where you're like, oh, now you have my interest, right?
hmm
Is the more and more I see, like the Martian rovers. My work is in large number of cars. The engineering mountain never seems to have a peak, and it's just always great to see what that next thing is of going from 10 100 to gig to 10 gig to 100 gig, and beyond is just exciting to keep up with it.
absolutely. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that it's still Ethernet. Like all these speeds and generations we've seen, PCI had to catch up with Ethernet. You know what I mean?
Yes,
So there's just something incredible about that that it's still relevant and iterating and keeping up.
I could take this card from 1997, and if I could find a PCI slot, I could still talk to this 100 gig card because it's still the frames are still
Yeah,
Ethernet, right? Is
perfect.
it would be through a switch, and the switch would convert for speeds. But the fact that your investment continues to this day is amazing, and just want to thank you for keeping those old technologies
Oh yeah.
alive, and appreciating some of the artistry that goes into some of these things, because I know as an engineer, we feel a lot of the times that we toil in the background, and when people like you bring some of that engineering out into the light, and show that even third, almost 25 years later, it still works. It has some
Yeah.
still very modern principles in it. It's very heartwarming, and I know it's really it brightened a lot of days, your video. So it's just
Oh,
wanted to
great.
thank you.
That means a lot. That means a lot to hear that. And I mean, I hope my excitement for this stuff comes across in the videos because I genuinely enjoy it and I do like to shed light. There's so much work. I mean, these machines are so complex. Like it's not like someone just
Yeah,
whipped it out and it was a failure or something. Like tons of engineering hours go into these things and a lot of thought. And I really saw that in the express line. Truly did, not just because I'm talking to you. I mean, I said it in the
yeah.
video. So yeah, it was my pleasure to do that, and I'm really happy you reached out and we were able to have this conversation. It's amazing.
I appreciate being in your sphere of influence, and if you have any more Ethernet questions, just let me know. I'm here
Excellent.
for you.
Yep, you'll be the one. One last time, I would like to stress how well built these things are. As a data point, I've got a SuperStack 2 Net Builder from 3Com. 3Com, of course, being the company founded by Bob Metcalfe, the grandfather of the Ethernet, the co-inventor. And when I plugged this thing in, it literally exploded. Oh yeah, I can smell it. If you'd like to see more videos like that, definitely check out my Patreon. And of course, the plastic faceplate is long gone. These things don't have any plastic involved at all, basically. They're all metal. They're just built like tanks. I can't stress that enough. But obviously, I'm accumulating a few more of these, and we're gonna start exploring the connectivity and management and try to get them stacking. Now, if you have any tips on where I can get the cables to stack the switches, they look like this, or the hubs, they have a slightly different form factor, let me know. I can't find them. And a huge thank you to Doug for being willing to sit down with me and talk about what it was like to be at Intel back when these were being created and some of the thinking that went into them. It's one thing to be able to look up, the throughput and all the stats and the prices and the release dates, but we were never going to find out that they were performance tested with Quake after hours, after sneaking them into the corporate data center, without sitting down and talking to the people like Doug that were there and that were involved in the development. So I'm incredibly thankful that I was able to sit down with Doug, and I hope you feel the same way. And a huge thanks to Steven, who sent me these original 2 units in the first place and kicked off this whole adventure. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've got more coming. You'll definitely be seeing the Express line again as we get them stacked, and I hope I see you in the next one. Thanks.